When I say salt beef, you probably think sailors, maybe pirates, maybe soldiers. But the reality of salt beef is that it would be common to everyone in the 18th century. Food preservation is so important to everyone's life every day. Doesn't matter whether it's 250 years ago or today. Salting was probably the most common food preservation technique, and yet we hardly use it today ever. We do have some preserved salted meats today in the grocery store. We just might not recognize them for what they are. They call it dried beef. But this is salted beef. It's dried in little slices and it's available to us. It is a version of salt beef in the time period. They've just made it in a way that we can use it easily. Very, very salty. You can also get other kinds of salted sausages. They're partially cured, but part of what's going on there is just the salt preservation in there. But in the 18th century, their salt provisions were just salt. That's it. They would preserve these big, giant chunks of meat in tons and tons of salt. And this was a technique that was used for literally thousands of years. Now, what's really going on when we salt beef? How can we take a piece of meat like this that at room temperature would go bad in a very short period of time and make it last for months, if not years, at room temperature? The real thing that's going on here is that when we pack salt around a piece of meat like this, what it does is it starts to pull the water components out of the meat. And water is really what's happening with bacterial action. If we can reduce the water content of any kind of food to as close to zero as we can get, then the bacterial activity goes way, way down. And while it may continue to decay in some ways, it's not going to go bad in the same kind of way. We can freeze dry meat and it'll last for a while. It's not gonna last forever and ever, especially if it's got oxygen. But if we can take salt and it starts to pull the water out of the meat, it also puts salt into the meat, and that sodium chloride, it kind of keeps some or most kinds of bacteria from growing, so that slows it down also. And after we repack our salt beef, we fill up the keg with a brine solution. We're also restricting oxygen. So it's kind of a triple whammy. We're really doing many different things to the meat to keep it from going bad. The interesting thing is we understand the science of this today, but in the 18th century and the hundreds of years before that, they had no idea exactly what was going on. They just knew it worked. Now, this salting technique was used for more than beef. It was used for salt pork and other items, especially salt fish. They would even salt vegetables at times. So the real question is, how is salt pork and salt beef different from each other? And we've talked about salt pork a lot on the channel, done a couple of episodes on it. And salt pork was the one that was probably in more demand. When you salted pork, it tended to work a little better. It was softer when it came out. It was probably a little easier and more tasty when you cooked it up. There were even circumstances where Joseph Paul Martin talked about the soldiers in very dire circumstances eating their salt pork raw. Now, I can't imagine that. I'm sure it wasn't very good like that. But salt beef, it would have been harder to do that. Salt beef generally gets harder as a meat. It can be very difficult to work with, and you have to soak it for a long time and boil it for a long time before it really becomes very edible. So if they ate tons and tons, probably millions of tons in the 18th century of salt beef and salt pork also, how did they cook it? What did they use it for? That's a really good question, and it's hard to answer. If you open up the 18th century cookbooks of the time period, there are, in reality, very few recipes that mention it specifically. Probably because it was usually cooked in one way, and that is they just boiled it. They just boiled it a lot. They might have put other things in with it to make a kind of a soup, so they might have put vegetables or something like barley in with it, but most of the time it was probably just boiled and served. There really isn't a whole lot of direction there. Although, if we look in the most popular cookbook of the 18th century, in Hannah Glass, she talks about dealing with salted meats, in the boiling section, obviously. And she says, if you're going to be boiling salt meat versus fresh meat, then you want to put it into cold water and allow it to come up to the boiling temperature, rather than take your meat and just toss it into the boiling water, which you would do with fresh meat. And the reason for that, found in a different cookbook, was that, as the author said, the salt would strike into the meat. It would make it saltier. It would force the salt back into the meat versus kind of releasing the salt. So if it just came up from a cold temperature, more of the salt would go back into the water. And another issue with salt meat was you had to soak it before you tried to cook with it. You had to first brush off all this salt, and then you would put it in baths of water for at least 12 hours and more likely 24 hours. So it took a lot of extra prep time. And if you're on board a ship where fresh water is hard to come by, they would soak it in salt water first. The salt water isn't as salty as the salted meat, so some of that salt would go away. They might even take a sort of a cage of metal or just hooks and put a big hook in the piece of salt beef and throw it overboard and drag it in the water like it was a piece of bait or something. And that would sort of keep washing the salt away. The problem is, of course, something might try to come up and eat your piece of salt beef, and it was difficult to have lots of pieces of meat trailing behind a ship. And when you're feeding sailors, you might be feeding 200 men or many more than that. So you have to deal with a lot of pieces of salt beef every day. I wanted to find a couple of references specifically to salt beef and how it was delivered, how they got it, especially in the military. And here's a letter from George Washington, and it's part of his orders. And he says, "You are to bespeak," in other words, to order, "all the pork and flour you can from the inhabitants upon the river Kennebec. A commissary will be immediately sent from the commissary general to agree and to pay for the same. You will also acquaint the inhabitants that the commissary will have orders to purchase 60 barrels of salted beef of 225 pounds each per barrel." Those are big barrels of salt beef. So let's make some salt beef like the directions from the 18th century. I'm not going to show every one of these steps because some of them I can't show easily because it takes a long period of time to do salt beef. But we can at least do some of these early stages and talk about what's going on. So salt beef. The meat would be cut up into 3 or 4 pound chunks. And like the meat I've got here is a 3.5 pound piece. This would be a normal size of piece of meat that they would use in the time period. They would then take this and put it into a salting vessel. Sometimes it might be a keg. If you were salting a smaller quantity of meat, you would use a salting tub. The idea of having a salting tub is normal for households. They're going to be salting meat all the time. And so they would have this large quantity of salt that was ready to go in a vessel so that you could start salting meat. So this meat would cool off, and then you would rub salt all over the top of it. Interestingly, in the time period, sometimes they called it powdered meat or powdering the meat because the salt they used, they would grind down into a smaller powder. So we want salt that gets into all the crevices. So we might powder it with salt and then put it into a larger vessel of salt around it. Now it's going to start pulling the moisture out immediately. And you would leave this for 10 to 12 days, maybe 2 weeks in this kind of a state. You might have a barrel that had these pieces of meat in their salt just waiting. But if you wanted this meat to last for months or years, then you would take the meat back out of this salting vessel. You would brush off all the salt. You would smell it. Is this piece still good? Is it bad? You would set aside the bad pieces, you would throw it out, or whatever you would do with that. Then the meat gets repacked into the barrel with fresh salt. After your meat has been repacked in the barrel, packed tightly with salt between each piece, then you would pour a brine solution. You want this to be a very briny solution, something that had so much salt in it that an egg would float. Then the head of the keg would be put on. You want to make sure that there was no air, at least as little air as you could possibly do it. And so this meat would be actually sitting in all that salt and in that brine solution. All the air bubbles are gone, it's nothing but salt, and we have nothing but good pieces of meat. When it's time to use your salt beef, it comes out of the keg, we wash the salt off of it, and we soak it in regular water. You can see these pieces that are just out of the salt. They are pretty tough. Now this has only been salting for about 10 or 12 days, so it hasn't really gotten to its normal, very, very hard state. In the 18th century, if you took that beef out of the keg and maybe it's been in there a year, sometimes longer than that, this meat would be very hard. Hard enough that it would be like wood. And in some cases, they would carve it like it was wood. It looked like mahogany, kind of brown and stiff. But when we want to use it, we're gonna soak it in water. If we get a chance to change the water a couple of times, it's gonna be better. Soak it 24 hours, and it starts to look even worse than this. This does not look appetizing, but after we soak it, it really looks bad. These pieces of meat have been soaking for about a day, and they don't look as good as this. They kind of turn gray, but at least they're a lot more flexible and hopefully more edible. Most people in the time period, again, would just boil this. You could, there are some recipes for using it in a boiled pudding. We would take this meat, we would cut it up into smaller pieces, put it inside of a pudding paste, or we could even use these pieces inside of something like a sea pie, which we've done on the channel before, where we take a pie and we put pieces like this in and either bake it or boil it. And this, again, is a way of cooking at a very low temperature. If we took this kind of meat and we put it on the grill or cooked it in some other way, like fried it in a pan, it would be very hard, very dry, and very salty. So all the different ways that they normally cook it in the 18th century were basically boiling it, or in the case of a boiled pie, we're just cooking it at 212 degrees. So again, a very, very gentle cooking method for a meat like this. I took some of the salt beef that had been soaking for 24 hours, cut it up into some smaller pieces, and lightly boiled it for more than an hour to have our example pieces here. And I didn't do anything else with it. Really, in most of these recipes, that's it. They just boiled it. And so we're gonna try it out just like that to get an idea about what it tastes like, what its texture is like. This did not stand in the salt for a year. Okay, this is just a short salting time period, which they did. But let's find out just what it tastes like. Actually, this is not over salty, which I was really afraid of, and its texture is not that bad. So for a gentle boil for an hour, hour and a half, it does get tender enough that it's very easy to eat. And if this was mixed in with something else, if this was in a standard soup, you probably wouldn't even notice it. You would have likely salted it up to that state anyway. So this turned out great. Even though it's not the year-old beef that comes out, which I'm sure would be much harder and that you would have to boil for quite a bit for it to get tender, it's actually quite good.